Welcome back to another Top 10 list, everyone. Francesca is out for this week, which means really anything goes. I can be as nerdy as I want to be, and I generally want to be pretty nerdy. So that's what we're going to do. We're going to be counting down the top 10 fantasy worlds or settings from a variety of different sources. Some from books, some from movies, TV, video games, those sorts of things. I'm very into this because I am a writer on Patreon. Which is going to influence this quite a bit, actually. But buckle up, because there's a lot of diversity in these worlds, and some of them you might not know about, some you might viciously disagree with. So I look forward to seeing that. I'm going to start off, by the way, by doing something that I get to do, because it's my list. My number 10 is going to be the world of Eldrith, the world of my Tales of Cloak and Claw. I'm only putting it at number 10, but I'm really into it, and I'm spending a lot of time on it. It is a world of animal fantasy. So no humans, just animals and magic and monsters. It's a big world. Like a lot of the worlds of animal fantasy are much smaller. But this, I want it to be as big and blown out as like high fantasy worlds. So the stories that I've written in this world, you can read those if you want to learn more about the world. I won't bore you with all the details since it's not something you're familiar with. But I think it's a pretty good setting. So I'm just going to put that as my number 10. And then we can get on to the ones you're more likely to be familiar with. Although this one, I'm not sure. My number 9 is the world of Prydain. It's the Chronicles of Prydain by Lloyd Alexander. It's an original fantasy world sort of based on Welsh mythology. And these are books that came out, I think, in like the 70s or the 80s. They've been adapted into a couple different movies, I think by Disney, The Black Cauldron. And I think they did The Book of Three. I don't think that many modern readers are familiar with this, although for me it was like one of the foundational series of books that I read, the Chronicles of Prydain. Having it be based on Welsh mythology gives it a bit of a different spin than a lot of modern fantasy novels in the way that things are named and some of the just the sort of like base level mythology and religious symbolism and all that in the world I find to be interesting. There are strange creatures that are kind of one-offs. There's this character, Gurgi, that I don't think you ever see another creature like him. He's this like sort of monkey-like human. And I like worlds that don't feel like they need to be totally systematized. Like everything doesn't have to be standardized. I like that. It feels, of all of the different worlds that cropped up in the wake of Lord of the Rings, many of which were obviously influenced by it, I like that it had more of a position. It had more of a voice. And so I've always loved Prydain. Number 8, I'm going to say, is the world of Harry Potter, which is not very high up on the list because, you know, J.K. Rowling and all that, but also because it's a world that will always have the fundamental flaw of inconsistency in that things would be added to the world for the book that was being written with no thought given to, is this a thing that should be in the world forever? And would often then be forgotten in future books, things like Time Turners and stuff like that. And so I've always found that a little bit frustrating. But that said, it's on the list because it is a world that, for all of the issues and the weird tropes, the stereotypes, and the weird racist and anti-Semitic stuff and all of that, it does have a lot of fun sort of baked into it. It is a world that is designed to appeal to kids in their like middle grade years. And it is very well designed for that. It is a world that as a kid you probably really would want to be in. And not a lot of these worlds are like that. It's not generally a thing where you create a world where people would want to be a part of it. But I like that. I think there should be more of that. I think Harry Potter is a great example of that. It's a place of discovery and wonder and possibility. And so it deserves a place in the list. Number 7 is probably going to get me in a little bit of trouble because it is the world of Middle-earth. And I know many people consider it to be the best fantasy world, the best fantasy setting. It's not my best fantasy setting, though. I appreciate the amount of world building and thought and that went into it, the breadth of details about the history and the geography and the language and the religion and all of that is awesome. But that's not the part of fantasy that I love as much. Middle-earth is almost the exact opposite of Harry Potter in that this is probably not a world that you'd like to be in. Like, really, I know it seems cool to, like, be a hobbit, but think about what that would actually be like in practice. Maybe you go to the tavern and that's fun, but the rest of it is just, you know, you're living in dirt and you're making vegetables. And that's honestly probably the best living out of all of them. Do you actually want to live in Rohan? or Gondor. I don't, generally. And then you got orcs running around and stuff. It's just not a world that is very inviting. It is very well crafted. And, you know, if you accept some of the fantastical stuff, realistic in a weird way, gritty, and I like that, but it's not my exact type. And, you know, I'm actually going to demonstrate that because my number 6 is the world of Narnia, which is, again, about as far as you can get from Middle-earth, in a different way than Harry Potter. I like it, and I grew up reading those books. The things that I like about it is that it is more based on wonder and exploration. It is a more fluid setting in a lot of different ways. I mean, literally, the sense of time is incredibly fluid, the relationship that it has with our own world. C.S. Lewis, by the way, if you're familiar with Narnia. Of course you're familiar with Narnia. They made multiple movies out of it. But I like that it is a very big and diverse setting. There's a lot of different settings. You know, some of the books are in sort of, you know, analogs to desert cultures. Some are off, you know, on the ocean. There's sort of more stereotypical sort of English countryside. I like that. You have the talking animals. You have, again, like with Prydain, you have a lot of stuff that's not standardized. You'll just all of a sudden have this strange, bizarre place or magic or creature. And I like that. It was creative. It obviously involves a lot of religious allegory, but it was done in a way that it didn't particularly bother me as a kid. I wasn't super religious, but I didn't really mind it. And so I just found it to be an interesting, expansive world where there was a lot of possibility space. And so I do like that. Now we get into some of the better known ones. So my number 5 is Randland, as it's commonly called by fans of The Wheel of Time, by Robert Jordan and eventually Brandon Sanderson. The Wheel of Time is, like, arguably my favorite fantasy series of all time, so one might think that the world would be my favorite. I love that, again, like Middle-earth, it is very well developed. Probably not to the same extent as Middle-earth, but the politics and the history and the language and all that is very well developed and very well thought out. I also really love, probably more than any of the others, the system of magic is just, it's like chef's kiss, for how much it has structure and it has rules, and yet it still provides a lot of opportunity for experimentation and new things and all of that. That said, like Middle-earth, I don't especially want to be in the world. Maybe if I could be an Aes Sedai. It's realistic in the way that, like, I guess a lot of these settings, like, it wouldn't be good to be a peasant. You don't want to live in a lot of these places. You'd end up dying in wars and stuff. And that's the sort of fantasy that makes for good reading, but I wouldn't want to be in it necessarily. And so I like that it is obviously inspired by Tolkien, but it makes some interesting choices and then really doubles down on stuff like the gender politics and magic, and that makes for a very interesting world. Number 4, we're cruising into the final choices, is going to be Westeros, or I guess Westeros and Essos, the entire world of A Song of Ice and Fire, the Game of Thrones by George R.R. Martin. I probably like Wheel of Time more than A Song of Ice and Fire as a series, but the world is, like, if you take, you know, I want to do the War of the Roses, I think it was, as fantasy, this is about the best possible interpretation of that to create a world from that I've ever seen, in creating a sort of realistic, grounded, European kind of world with some other cultures on the periphery, but that really feels lived in, like, kind of like Middle-earth, but without requiring as much development. I mean, I know he's written some sort of, like, world-building books and everything, but it just feels more organic, and it feels like it focuses on the fun parts, like the legend as opposed to the genealogy, I guess is the way that I would put that. It is more fluid in the presence and evolution of magic. It provides a lot of space for people to explore around in, and like, of the, I guess, of those sorts of worlds, Westeros, Randland, Middle-earth, Prydain, that are, like, relatively realistic, I think it strikes the best balance of being fun and big and having exploration and wonder and all of that. And so, yeah, Westeros, great books, great setting too. Number 3 is going to be Faerun of the Forgotten Realms, probably the most well-known, I guess, of the Dungeons and Dragons settings. Maybe Dragonlance, I don't know. I like Dark Sun. But anyway, Faerun is a massive, well-developed, traditional fantasy world of almost every sort of setting I guess you can find in there, all developed to an extent that I don't know if any other place is. I mean, even like there are aspects of Middle Earth, like language and all that, and the history that's very well developed. But Faerun has been collectively developed by so many different authors and game masters over time that every little hamlet and every little corner of the map, which is huge, has been incredibly well developed and explored, which some people might find to be a downside in that there's, I guess, less exploration possible in a world that's so well developed. But I think this is a world that you can find something that you will like in. And that's what I really like about it. It's got, I think, the most interesting underground setting in oh my god, the Underdark, apologies, where, you know, the Dark Elves live, and the, you know, and all of that, the books set in Menzoberranzan. It's got the Sword Coast and Icewind Dale, and like little corners from which dozens of novels can be written. Like, I think I get out of Faerun what a lot of people get out of Middle-earth in wanting to really dive deep into a setting. And then after decades of reading books in it or playing games in it, I've played, you know, many role-playing game scenarios in Faerun, realizing that you've explored 2% of the whole world. It's just an amazing feeling for someone who's really into fantasy. And now we get into weirder ones, where people might have a problem with my choices, and a case could be made that any of these top 5 could switch positions with each other. So that's my caveat to you. But number 2 is going to be Thra of the Dark Crystal, which, compared to some of these, there's not nearly as much done in it. There's not as much written about it. There are some books, there's some graphic novels and comics and video games. Mainly there's the movie The Dark Crystal and then the series The Dark Crystal Age of Resistance. And so it's not as well developed. But out of all these worlds, I think that Thra probably has, it takes the strongest stand to be like, we're not just going to be Middle-earth with a few variations. We're going to be this specific thing that we want to be. There's no humans. We've got Gelfling and Podlings and the Skeksis, and everything's weirdly organic, and there's like weird animal plant hybrids, and everything's kind of vibrant, and just everything's bizarre and surreal in a weird way. And it's all very tied into the plot of the story, which is true of some of these. Some of them, like, you could set almost any story in it. Some of them, like in Thra and the Dark Crystal, like that's the story that could take place in this world. But I love someone really saying, this is the fantasy world I want to make. I want it to look like this. It has its own feel. If you were put into this world, you'd know what world you're in, because no other world is going to look like this. And I like that. And I think that there's some great world building with the Gelfling. I think that the Skeksis make for very interesting politics on a more intimate level. A lot of these series will have politics on like a national or a world level. You get a little bit of that with just this council of weirdos in the Dark Crystal. And so that's my number 2. I've been very clear for a long time of how much I like Dark Crystal and how I wish there was more of it. And so it had to be on the list. And then there's my number 1, where I don't know if you've been sort of like trying to figure out what's left. And there are some that I'm just not that familiar with enough to be on my list. So, you know, the World of the Witcher is not going to be on here. I liked the games, but I just don't know it that well. And then there's some others like Xanth and, you know, Ankh-Morpork, I think it's called, Discworld. But I just don't have enough familiarity for it to be on the list. So my number 1 is, and we're going to have an argument, the Galaxy from Star Wars. And I know, it's not fantasy, it's sci-fi, but it's not. It's not science fiction, in that what is written in it, why people enjoy it, is not about exploring the intersection of technology and culture, or science and art, or it's not Black Mirror, you know? It's not even Star Trek to that extent. It has technology, it has spaceships and blasters, but it's a fantasy world. Like, you go in there for the wonder and the exploration and the stories that are more intimate. You go in there for the reasons that you go in any fantasy story. It just happens to have X-Wings. And so I'm not saying that, like, my favorite stories ever written are in this world. I prefer some of the novels of the Wheel of Time more than this. Probably true of many of these. But as a setting, it's a galaxy. It's huge. You can have almost anything, and many of the things that are in it I find interesting. In any setting, whether it's more traditional, terrestrial fantasy or something like Star Wars, you have to make certain decisions about what's going to be in the world and what's not going to be in the world, and I think a lot of those choices just line up with what I want. I like that there's magic, effectively, in the Force. I like that it has some structure, but not too much. I like that there is, depending on which story you're talking about, sort of a core conflict of, a rebellion against an empire, which feels very fantasy as well. A lot of the tropes of fantasy, of the wizards and the princess and the warrior and all that are here, the scoundrel. I like that you have more developed areas, Coruscant and all that, and then you have the Outer Rim. It feels very fantasy world in that respect. And just the diversity of the alien species, the diversity of the alien planets gives you so much exploration and wonder and adventure and room for different subtle shifts in genre that I just really enjoy. So I understand some people will be frustrated with this, and I know there's an argument to be had, but I think it makes sense for this world, or for this list, and so that is my number one. And that is my top 10. I hope that you enjoyed it. I hope that, I always try to do something a little bit different when Francesca's out. But if you have any ideas, whether for lists that I would do with Francesca or solo, you, of course, can send those to me. I would love to see them. Thanks for your support as always, and I'll see you soon.